In the autumn of 1896, a classroom supervisor named Nellie Burroughs walked into a first-grade room at a public school on the west side of Chicago and watched a teacher instruct 31 children to look at the word cat printed on a board and say it together. The children said cat. The teacher moved to the next word. Burroughs stood at the back of the room for 20 minutes and then wrote a 2-sentence note in her supervisor's logbook. The children are being taught to recognize the shape of words. They are not being taught to read them. Burroughs had been supervising Chicago classrooms for 9 years. She knew what reading instruction looked like. What she was watching was something different, a method that had been arriving in Chicago schools over the previous 3 years through a curriculum revision program funded by a philanthropic foundation whose name appeared on the revised textbooks, but whose reasoning for the revision had never been explained to the teachers delivering it. She filed her observation with the district's curriculum office. The curriculum office acknowledged it. Nothing changed. By 1910, the method Burroughs had watched being introduced in that Chicago classroom, a method that taught children to recognize whole words by their visual shape rather than to decode them letter by letter through the sounds those letters represented, had been formally adopted in school districts across 14 states. By 1930, it was the dominant reading instruction method in American public schools. By 1955, a reading specialist named Rudolf Flesch published a book called Why Johnny Can't Read that documented, with clinical precision, what had happened to American reading ability in the half-century since Nellie Burroughs wrote her 2-sentence observation. Flesch's book spent 37 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It named the method. It named the institutions that had promoted it. It named the documented decline in reading ability that the method had produced. The educational establishment responded to it not with investigation but with dismissal. Flesch was characterized as a crank. The method continued. What Nellie Burroughs had watched being introduced in 1896 was the beginning of one of the most consequential and least examined shifts in American public education, a shift whose origins, whose funding, and whose effects on the population that experienced it have never been the subject of any official public accounting. Before we go further, if investigations like this are what you come here for, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand why the shift from phonics to whole word reading instruction happened, and why it happened when it did, we have to go back to the decades just before Burroughs walked into that Chicago classroom, and to the specific intersection of industrial philanthropy, educational reform, and a theory of social management that the men who funded the shift never stated publicly but documented with remarkable candor in their private correspondence and internal memoranda. The phonics method of reading instruction, teaching children to decode written language by connecting letters to sounds, had been the standard approach in American schools since the colonial period. To understand what was lost when it was replaced, it helps to look at what the historical literacy data actually shows. The Union Army's entrance examinations in the Civil War era required recruits to read passages of moderate complexity and demonstrate comprehension. The pass rate on those examinations exceeded 90% across multiple years of testing, drawn from a population that included large numbers of men with limited formal schooling. The Adjutant General's Office noted in its 1863 annual report that the reading ability of the average Union recruit was sufficient to allow independent use of written military regulations and correspondence, a standard that subsequent military literacy assessments would not consistently meet again until the phonics revival of the late 20th century. Letters written by ordinary soldiers in the Civil War, farm boys, factory workers, men with 3 or 4 years of formal schooling, demonstrate a command of written language that modern literacy researchers have described in published assessments as exceeding the average reading ability documented in 20th century American adults. The method that produced that command was not sophisticated. It was the alphabet, the phoneme-to-letter correspondence, and the practice of sounding out words until decoding became automatic. It worked, and it was replaced. It was the method by which the founding generation had been taught to read. It was the method described in Noah Webster's 1783 spelling book, which was the most widely used educational text in the early American Republic. It was the method that had produced, by the late 19th century, a level of functional literacy in the American public that contemporary accounts, newspaper literacy rates, census data, military entrance examination records, suggest was considerably higher than anything the 20th century has since achieved. An 1840 census analysis estimated American adult literacy at approximately 97%. An 1882 study of Massachusetts school records found that the average student completing elementary education could read and comprehend texts of substantial complexity. The method that had produced these results was not broken, it was not failing, it was not in need of replacement. The men who replaced it did not claim it was failing, they claimed something else entirely. John Dee. Rockefeller established the General Education Board in 1902 with an initial endowment of $1 million, later expanded to over $180 million, a sum that in the first decade of the 20th century represented a financial influence over American education without precedent in the country's history. The board's stated mission was the promotion of education in the United States. Its internal documents describe a mission that was considerably more specific. Frederick T. Gates, who served as Rockefeller's chief philanthropic advisor and the primary architect of the General Education Board's program, wrote in the board's 1904 internal memorandum a description of its educational goals that has been quoted by researchers critical of the board for over a century, and that the board's defenders have never effectively refuted as a misrepresentation of its intent. Gates wrote that the work of education was not to make thinkers of the common people, but to make them tractable, people who would work in the industries and fill the positions that the existing social order required, without the capacity for independent judgment that a thorough literary education produced. That is not a paraphrase, that is what the document says. The General Education Board did not write curriculum, it funded the institutions that did. Between 1902 and 1934, the board distributed approximately $325 million, roughly equivalent to $5 billion in current value, across American educational institutions. The distribution was not random. It was strategic, directed towards specific institutions whose output would shape the direction of American education at scale. Teachers College at Columbia University received substantial board funding during the period when it became the most influential teacher training institution in the country. The University of Chicago's Education Department received board support during the period when its curriculum research shaped the content of textbooks used in classrooms across the country. The National Education Association, which set the professional standards that governed what was considered best practice in American classrooms, received board support during the decades when the whole word method was being established as that best practice. The funding did not purchase specific outcomes in any direct documented transaction. It created institutional environments in which specific outcomes were the natural product of the research priorities, publication opportunities, and professional incentives that the funding established. That is how institutional influence works at scale. It does not require conspiracy. It requires investment. It funded the university education departments that trained the teachers. It funded the curriculum development organizations that produced the textbooks. It funded the education journals that shaped the professional consensus about what constituted good pedagogy. Through those channels, diffuse, institutional and difficult to trace to a single decision, it shaped the direction of American public education in the first 3 decades of the 20th century with a thoroughness that no government program had ever achieved, and without any public democratic mandate to do so. The whole word reading method arrived in American classrooms through exactly those channels. The method had been developed in Europe, specifically in Prussia, where an educational reformer named Friedrich Gedig had proposed whole word recognition as a reading introduction technique in the 1780s. In Prussia, It had been part of a broader educational system explicitly designed to produce a population suited to industrial labour and military service, disciplined, obedient, capable of following instructions, and not particularly inclined toward the kind of independent intellectual engagement that extensive reading fluency produced. Horace Mann, the Massachusetts education reformer who spent 1843 touring European schools and returned to advocate for the reform of American public education on the Prussian model, brought the whole word method back with him as one component of a broader shift towards systematized, institutionalized schooling. Mann's influence on American education was substantial. His advocacy for the whole word method was noted at the time as controversial. A group of Boston schoolmasters published a formal rebuttal to his European report in 1844, arguing that the whole word method produced children who could recognize a limited vocabulary but could not decode new words, children who were, in the language of that rebuttal, taught to read without being taught to read. That objection was filed in 1844. It was not answered then, and it has not been answered since. The Boston schoolmasters who wrote it were experienced practitioners describing a specific observable problem. Children taught by the whole word method could recognize the words they had been taught and could not read words they had not been taught. They were not readers in any functional sense. They were pattern recognizers trained on a limited vocabulary without the decoding tools to expand it independently. This is not a subtle educational distinction. It is the difference between a child who can navigate any written text and a child who is dependent on instruction for every new word they encounter. The first child is intellectually independent. The second requires an intermediary between themselves and written knowledge for as long as they live. The 1844 Boston schoolmasters understood this distinction clearly and stated it plainly. The institutional infrastructure that spent the following century promoting the whole word method either did not understand the distinction or understood it and found it acceptable. The method Mann brought back from Prussia was the method Nellie Burroughs watched being installed in Chicago classrooms in 1896. The funding that installed it came in the following decade from the General Education Board. The educational journals that defended it were funded by the same sources. The teacher training programs that trained the teachers who delivered it were shaped by the same institutional infrastructure. The chain from Frederick Gates's 1904 memorandum to the classroom Burroughs supervised runs through 30 years of institutional investment, but it runs without interruption. A reading specialist named Samuel Blumenfeld spent 40 years documenting the history of reading instruction in American public schools and published his most comprehensive account in 1973 under the title The New Illiterates. Blumenfeld's research traced the whole word method spread through the American school system institution by institution, funding source by funding source, textbook series by textbook series. His documentation is specific, named and sourced. His book was reviewed in specialist educational publications and ignored by the mainstream press. It was not adopted as a text in any university education department. It did not change the method being used in American classrooms. The method continued. Rudolf Flesch's 1955 Why Johnny Can't Read had documented the reading ability decline with enough specificity and enough public clarity to force a response. The response from the educational establishment was not reform. It was a counter-publication. A book called Why Johnny Can Read, published in 1956 by a Columbia Teachers College reading specialist named Neela Banton Smith, which argued that the data Flesch had presented was selectively interpreted and that the whole word method produced readers of sufficient competence for contemporary life. Smith's book received significantly more institutional support than Flesch's. It was adopted as a resource in teacher training programs. It was reviewed favorably in the educational journals that the same institutional infrastructure had shaped since the General Education Board's founding. It did not engage with Flesch's core argument. It simply produced a counter-narrative with better institutional backing and let the weight of that backing settle the public debate. The General Education Board has never publicly explained the relationship between Frederick Gates's 1904 memorandum describing the goal of producing tractable rather than thinking citizens and the board's subsequent funding of whole word reading instruction curriculum across American school systems. It has never explained why the documented decline in American reading ability that followed the whole word method's adoption, a decline that Flesch documented in 1955, that Blumenfeld documented in 1973, and that subsequent researchers have continued to document, did not produce a formal institutional review of the method's origins and the interests that had promoted it. It has never explained why the educational establishment's response to both Flesch's and Blumenfeld's documented findings was dismissal and counter-publication rather than the independent replication study that the seriousness of the findings warranted. Why would an institution whose stated purpose was the promotion of education in the United States fund a reading instruction method that produced demonstrably lower reading ability than the method it replaced, unless producing lower reading ability was consistent with, rather than contrary to, the institution's actual purpose? Why does the internal documentation of the General Education Board, documentation that is held at the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York, and is accessible to qualified researchers, contain a founding memorandum describing the goal of making the common people tractable rather than capable of independent thought, and why has no public accounting of the relationship between that stated goal and the educational programs the board funded ever been conducted by any governmental body? Why did the whole word method survive Flesch's 1955 public documentation of its effects, Blumenfeld's 1973 detailed institutional history, and decades of subsequent evidence showing that phonics instruction produced stronger readers, surviving each of these challenges through institutional dismissal rather than substantive engagement, if the method's continued use was simply the product of pedagogical disagreement rather than institutional interest in its continuation? These questions do not go away because the General Education Board no longer exists and because the whole word method has been partially displaced in recent decades by phonics-based approaches following decades of advocacy by reading researchers outside the institutional mainstream. The displacement came late, came incompletely, and came without any public accounting of how the original shift occurred, who funded it, what they wrote about their intentions, and what the documented effect on American literacy has been. Nellie Burroughs retired from Chicago public school supervision in 1909. She made no further public statements about reading instruction. She gave no interviews. She published nothing. Her logbooks, 9 volumes covering her full supervisory career, are held in the Chicago Board of Education's Historical Archive on West Madison Street. Researchers who have examined them describe them as detailed, observant, and consistent in the precision of their documentation. The 2-sentence entry from autumn 1896 is not exceptional in its quality. It is exceptional only in what it describes: a supervisor, trained to know what she was looking at, watching a method arrive in her classrooms that she immediately identified as not teaching children to read. She wrote it down. She filed it. The system acknowledged it and did not act on it. And for the next 60 years, the children who passed through those classrooms were taught at scale, with public money and institutional authority, in precisely the way she had identified as wrong on a Tuesday afternoon in 1896. The 2-sentence entry from 1896 is on page 47 of the autumn volume. The curriculum office that received her observation and acknowledged it and did nothing processed hundreds of similar observations in the same period from supervisors across the city who had noticed the same thing she had noticed. Those observations are in the same archive. They document from inside the system that was being changed, the awareness that something was being changed, and the institutional decision, repeated across dozens of acknowledgements and 0 responses, not to examine it. The official history tells us that reading instruction in American public schools evolved through the 20th century in response to developing pedagogical research, and that the shifts between methods represented the genuine application of educational science to the challenge of teaching children to read, what the General Education Board's internal documents, Nellie Burrows's logbooks, Samuel Blumenfeld's sourced institutional history, and Rudolf Flesch's documented literacy data tell us is that the shift from phonics to whole word instruction was funded by men who wrote in their own internal documents that they wanted a less literate, more tractable population, and that the educational establishment charged with evaluating the shift's effects responded to every documented critique of it, not with investigation, but with the institutional weight necessary to keep the critique from reaching the population that had experienced the consequences. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects the General Education Board's curriculum funding to a 1918 congressional investigation into the influence of private philanthropy on American public education, an investigation that produced a published report recommending formal legislative limits on philanthropic control of school curriculum. The report was published. The legislation was never introduced. The congressman who chaired the investigation died in office 2 years later. His papers, including correspondence related to the investigation, are held at the Library of Congress. The folder labeled General Education Board correspondence is empty.